preparing for the
That's probably the barbecue
thing. Yeah, maybe they'll have spare some for us anyway. Anyway, good evening.
Are we meant to get some from them?
Not that I know of. No, not food. I meant people. But, anyway, good evening. Spencer, just in time. About to start.
Okay, great.
We're running on the same schedule.
Well, nobody's on my schedule.
That's what you thought, but it turned out. Good evening. Hello.
How are you? Okay. You too?
We're about to start. We're on page 899. We actually have the recording on already.
I'm late.
No. You're right on time. We're about to start. Perfect timing. All right.
Did they do the second scotch tonight as well?
Yes, after the
Yes. Starting officially at 8 o'clock, I think.
Let's get down to business.
It's the serious business. Here's for you. We're on page 899 in the English, no problem. All right. Last week, let's review what we spoke about last week, right? We're in the middle of chapter 6 of the second part of the Tanya. What did we discuss last week? We discussed that Shem Elokim, which is what we use to refer to God's power of self-concealment, when God conceals himself in the act of creation, right? There's two names, and the two names describe two actions of Hashem. There's the Shem Havaya, the four-letter name of Hashem, which describes his self-revelation or his kindness, where he reveals himself. And how does he reveal himself? By creating from something to nothing. But then there's also Shem Elokim. Shem Elokim conceals himself in that act. That every time when he creates something from nothing, he's not revealed in that act. We can't see him in the thing that he creates. Even though, as we discussed in the first chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, as we discussed in chapters 1 through 3, the true nature of reality, the true nature of everything is only godliness, we should, when we look at everything around us, everything that's created, something from nothing, we should see only godliness. The reason why we don't see it is because Shem Elokim conceals him. And last week we discussed how this Shem Elokim, right, we asked, what's the Elokim to the Shem Elokim? In other words, what limits God's self-limitation, right? Why were we asking that question? Because we said that if God has an infinite power to conceal himself, then that infinite power should act the same everywhere, right? There shouldn't be different levels of worlds. There shouldn't be different types of things with different levels of holiness, different natures, different forms. Everything should be the same. There should be one revelation and one concealment. Where does all the different levels of concealment, the different aspects of concealment, where do they come from? Is there another Shem Elokim which provides the limitation on God's limitation, so that God's only a little bit concealed in an unholy thing? Right, God's only a little bit concealed in a holy thing, but he's much more concealed in an impure thing, right, for example, right? So where does the differences in Shem Elokim come from? And the answer, as we explained it, is that Shem Elokim does not need a Shem Elokim. There does not need to be another power which limits God's limitation. Why is that? Because, as we explained, and really we were explaining this in chapter 5, and we were explaining this in the end of chapter 4, it's really the same idea over and over again with different emphases, different ways of approaching the idea. But as we explained before, Shem Elokim, God's self-concealment, is not a separate power from Shem Havaya. It's not that God has two separate powers, right, that are absolutely separate. That he has a Shem Havaya, which is one thing entirely, and a Shem Elokim, which is a totally different thing. There's a self-revelation and self-concealment, and never the twain shall meet, and then he puts them together to create things. As we've been explaining over and over again. Pardon me?
It's continuous.
It's continuous. It's one act, right? Is the way I've been saying it. It's one act. When God creates something, it's not a Havaya with an Elokim adjoined to it. It's an act of Havaya Elokim. It's the two together. And every time that Havaya is acting, any one of the infinite things that God creates, it creates through Shem Elokim. And we were saying, what's the metaphor, for example, right? We said that when a parent expresses or the teacher, right? The teacher, I think, was the least confusing one. That when the teacher teaches the student, right? When Einstein teaches a high school freshman, right? He has to limit his knowledge in order to teach it at a level that the student can appreciate, right? So the thing is that from his perspective, from Einstein's perspective, his limitation, right? The fact that he's not teaching everything that he knows is really part of the process of revelation. Right? It's part of the process of revealing something. If he revealed everything that he knew, the student would get nothing, right? Because it's way above his level. In order for the student to get at his level, Einstein has to withhold things that he knows. So the question is this really an act of withholding? And the Alter Rebbe says, no. This withholding is one and the same as part of the act of revelation. And we explained that this is even greater by God than it is by any human example we can give. Like, for example, like we just said, from the student and the teacher, even the teacher, even the example that we're giving, when the teacher is withholding, it's fundamentally a different act than the act of revealing. Right? In other words, the teacher, the reason why it's part of revealing, the reason why Einstein is really revealing when he withholds part of his knowledge is because his intention of withholding his knowledge is to reveal to the student, right? But the act of withholding is still an act of withholding. We said last week, God is the only exception. True unity, true achdus, true unity between opposites is only by God, such that when God holds himself back, it is the very same act in which he is concealing himself that he is revealing himself. By God, it's literally one act. It's not like Einstein, who has to withhold some of his knowledge and then teach. Two separate acts, both with the intention of revealing, of self-revelation. Rather, by God, it's one act. The very act which creates a thing is the same act which conceals God within it. His kindness, his expression, and his discipline, severity, self-concealment is the one, literally one and the same act. Yes, this is what we spoke about last week. Now, this fact is what allows the Alter Rebbe to do as Bob Dylan does and bring it all back home. Right? That's what we're going to do now on page 899. In other words, this is really what we're going to learn tonight and in the coming weeks. This is really the grand conclusion to which the Alter Rebbe has been working. Given the inevitable process as we've been studying it from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3 to chapter 4 to chapter 5, now in chapter 6 we're going to see the Alter Rebbe is going to reference what he said all the way at the beginning of chapter 1. In other words, now we are finally in a position, given all of this information, to understand the question, to answer the point that the Alter Rebbe made all the way at the beginning of the book. Yes? So, let us read. I'll just make sure I'm not good. Too far. No, we're perfect. Okay. And right at the top of page 898. Right at the top of page 898. V'zeu shekosov. This is what the verse says, right? This, that God's kindness and God's severity, God's self-revelation and his self-concealment are really the same thing, are really one act. It's a description of one divine act, and they have a unity, and each one of them is totally united with God. This is what the verse says, that you should take it to heart that Hashem is Elokim. Right? This verse is a verse that we had all the way at the beginning of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, right? Who remembers the question? The question the Alter Rebbe asks is, the verse seems to be telling us that Hashem is the only God, right? That's the simple translation of Hashem hu Elokim. Right? That Hashem, our God, is the only God. Our God is the only power in heaven and earth, right? To which the Alter Rebbe asks, why would a person have such an assumption that there are other powers to the extent that the Torah has to negate it by saying you should take it to heart, right? In other words, the whole phrase, take it to heart, this should ring bells for those who have been with us since the beginning. The whole phrase, take it to heart, that the verse says, implies that your heart should have some leaning otherwise. right? In other words, your heart naturally by itself, which we explained at the beginning as the animal soul, right? The human being's animal tendencies, good evening, the heart itself should want something the opposite of what the verse is saying. And the Alter Rebbe said, if all the verse is saying is that Havaya Hu Elokim, God is God, who we are calling God, is the only power in heaven on earth, right? What is it in your heart that denies him? The Alter Rebbe said, do people naturally walk around with the axiomatic belief, with the deep-held emotional principle that there are other gods, right? In other words, are people born idol worshippers? Do they believe there's a God under the sea other than our God? The Alter Rebbe asks, right? The verse must be saying something else that you have to take to heart, right? When it says, you should know that Hashem Hu Elokim. Right? What does it actually mean? The Alter Rebbe finally explains what he asked all the way back in chapter 1, all the way at the beginning of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. Pirush. What does this mean? Sheshnei shemus elu, these two names of God, Hashem and Elokim, hem echad mamish, are literally one. Shagam Shem Elokim, that even Shem Elokim, even this name of God which we refer to describing his self-concealment, Hametzamtzem Umaleh Ma'or, which contracts and conceals the light, Hu Bechinas Chesed Kamei Shem Havaya, it itself is kindness, it itself is a divine revelation just as much as Shem Havaya is. It itself is an act of divine revelation. Why? Mishum shemidesav, because the attributes, the traits, Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God, misyachdos imay beyichud gamor, are totally united with him with an absolute unity. V'hu u'shmei echad, he and his name are one. Shemidesav hein shmeisav, that his attributes are his names, and his names are united with him. Yes? In other words, this verse that is coming to us and saying, you should know today, and you should take it to heart, that Hashem is Elokim. What does it mean? It means you sit down your animal soul, and you go through the following thought, right? And you should really it's one thought, all the way from the beginning of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, right? This is the one extended contemplation you're supposed to have, right? You're supposed to think that I know because the Torah tells me that the world is created something from nothing. And therefore, I know that because it's created something from nothing, it's being spoken into existence by God at every moment. And the fact that it's being spoken into existence by God at every moment means that the world is absolutely nothing but the divine revelation, right? Which we can call Shem Havaya. And therefore I know that since I don't experience the world this way, there must be a divine self-concealment which is called Shem Elokim. Right? There must be a divine act of him concealing himself from me. But therefore I know that since he is concealing himself from me, and it is that very concealment which creates the form of everything that I see, that this concealment must be in the same act as Shem Havaya. But therefore I know that if they truly are in the same act, then Havaya and Elokim must both be united with God. Right? Because the true unity, the only way that Elokim and Havaya could actually combine, the only way these two opposites can come together, I'm summarizing everything we've said so far. The only way these two attributes can come together and create something like the table or the chair or a frog or a human being is if they are both equally godly. They're both in one act. Right? They're in one act, and this unity is something that only God could do, because only God can put two opposites together. Therefore, I know that Havaya and Elokim are both equally godly traits. I can't say that Elokim is more godly or Havaya is more godly. They're both equally godly, because if either one were more godly, then it would be the dominant one. It would be the truly infinite one, which we see is not the case. Everywhere that Havaya creates, Elokim is there, as we explained last week. Therefore, Havaya and Elokim must be one. There is no difference between them. Havaya and Elokim, if both of them are truly infinite, and both of them are truly united with God, it must be that they are actually one. It must be that they actually have a true unity. This whole contemplation that I have just described is what you are supposed to take to heart. That's what you're supposed to know and take to heart, because the heart naturally, right? What's the heart's issue? The heart's issue is that even though intellectually I can understand how the world is totally united with God, as we described in chapters 1 through 3, I don't see that in the world. I don't have any perception of that. I don't have any deep experience of that, right? I can think all day long in an abstract way how the world is totally united with God, but in my heart, what do I think is real? The regular perception of the world. The table is just a table. It's not God. It's not an expression of God, right? The cup is the cup, right? I don't experience God within everything in my world. So what are you supposed to do, says the Alter Rebbe? You're supposed to do what the Pasuk says and contemplate this idea that Havaya is Elokim, which is really, from chapter 2 to now, the Alter Rebbe has taught it in a way that it's almost an inexorable logical progression. If you really understand what each point says, it leads directly to the next point. So it's a contemplation. It's something you're supposed to think, and if you understand it, you'll be brought to the next point, and to the next point, and to the next point, until you must reach the conclusion here. In chapter 6, right, with a deep understanding, and the mind controls the heart, right? The mind teaches the heart. You'll understand with a deep understanding that even though when I look at the table, I cannot see that it is nothing but godliness, nevertheless, this concealment itself is just as much an expression of godliness as if it were to be revealed. There's no difference, right? The concealment and the revelation are equally godly. Right? This is really the point that the Alter Rebbe has been building towards. What is it that inspires a love of God, as we said in the Chinuch Katan in the introduction to the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah? What is it that allows a person to have their love of God? And what did we say? Like a child, right? That a child can always fall back on their education when they're young. That's how our love of God is supposed to be. Not something that comes as a once-in-a-while inspiration, right? But we're supposed to have a groundwork that allows us to rekindle that flame inside of us of love of God whenever we want, right? So what allows us to rekindle that flame? It is this contemplation. It is this set of information here through chapter 6. Because, as Alter Rebbe is going to now explain at length, when a person realizes that even God's concealment within everything, in other words, not his experience of the world, right? Because if you remember, right, what was our metaphor? It was that the water in the red cup, right, was the metaphor. You have clear water with no color in a red cup. So we said, from the water's perspective, the water knows that it's clear. In other words, God knows from his perspective that the world is only godliness. But when we look at the water, we see red water. We see it only from the outside. The conclusion is meant to be that there is no outside perspective from which God is distant. In other words, the red water itself, right, the glass, the water, and our experience of both of them together are really all the same thing. There's no division of experience here. Our experience of the concealment is just as godly as our experience of the revelation. That's really what the Alter Rebbe is coming here to say. So before we said that only the divine, before we were saying that it's only really the divine light, from the perspective of the divine light, the divine revelation, Shem Havaya, it was true that the world is absolutely united with God, right? But we said, but what about Shem Elokim? In other words, a different way of putting this, right, L'chaim? A different way of putting this is that Shem Elokim, right, is God himself creating a certain perspective, right? It's all about perspective. It's all about how you experience things, right? So Shem Elokim is God himself creating a certain perspective. He's creating a perspective from which he's concealed, right? That perspective is the perspective of the creation, right? We exist within Shem Elokim, so to speak, conceptually, right? Logically. We can't see past Shem Elokim. All our experiences are filtered through Shem Elokim, through the divine self-concealment. That's why we experience things as independent objects, having their own qualities, right? Not godly. We don't experience God in everything that we experience, right? My tea tastes like tea. It doesn't taste like God, whatever that would mean, right? So, yeah. All of our experiences come through Shem Elokim, yes? What we're saying now is that because Shem Elokim and Shem Havaya are not really two separate powers, they cannot be two separate powers, truly separate powers, right? Therefore, the divine concealment in two aspects, which I will elaborate in a moment, the divine concealment in two ways is actually just the same thing as the divine revelation. In other words, it's not that we must know that within this concealment there is a truth which only God can see, that He is present in everything, right? The truth is that even in the concealment, even in the lie, which is why it's not a lie, right? Even in the lie, even in the perspective which He creates for the creation, right? This separation, this division from God, that we don't experience Him, that division itself, the experience of the separation, is itself godly. Therefore, there is no experience which is not godly. There is no experience which is not divine. Right? The whole dichotomy between a direct experience of God and an experience of things in our everyday life is really a false dichotomy, is really what we're saying. We are saying that if we could really see the truth, right, if we were just a little bit more insightful, we would see that, on the contrary, the diverse and non-godly experiences in our day-to-day life, they themselves are as godly as it would be if we could see the divine light itself, totally unfiltered by Shem Elokim, right? It's the same truth. Now, to understand this, it takes a lot more than what I've just said. I've given the point, right? Now we have to go into the details, right? Which is how we do in a lot of things in this class, right? First we have the idea, but now there's a lot of details. So let's enter into some of the details. Let's enter into some of the details. Yeah.
What do you think is not understood at this point?
What's not understood is really what this means, right? Because the question is,
I mean, I didn't say I understood any of it.
No, I understand. But the thing that's the real sticking point is that we seem to be saying something very contradictory, which is that the experience of the non-godly is really the experience of the godly, right? The question is, what does that mean? In other words, clearly when I drink my tea and it tastes like tea, this is not this would seem, right, at least, it seems reasonable to say, this is not an experience of the direct light of God. It's not the same as when a tzaddik, for example, right, a true tzaddik looks at the tea and all he sees is the divine word of God that's speaking it into existence. I'm assuming that there's some sort of differentiation to be made, right? The question is, what is the nature of that differentiation? And as we're going to see, the differentiation is very, very, very slight, right? Which is really the Alter Rebbe's point. The whole contemplation that brings us to love of God is to realize that everything we love already, right? Everything we already appreciate, right? As before, the whole idea is this is the whole philosophy of Chassidus Chabad, right? Because the whole idea is that the Alter Rebbe is trying to put through in terms of worship of God, right, is that you may think that to have a mystical experience of God, you have to ascend into the upper realms, and you have to be like a tzaddik, and Shem Elokim has to be completely torn away, and you have to see the inner unity of all things, right, and the cup has to not be the cup, and the table has to not be the table. Here the Alter Rebbe is saying the exact opposite. The Alter Rebbe is saying the cup in its cupness, the table in its tableness, right, each and every individual thing in its individual nature, which is exactly what makes it not divine, as we explained extended length about Shem Elokim, that the form of the thing, right, is always concealing over the godly form, the nature, right, as we said, Elokim is the nature, the true essence of the thing is concealing over the divine. The Alter Rebbe is saying that the mystical experience is actually in everything. The mystical experience is not to tear away the lie of everything. The experience of God, to know God, I don't mean intellectually, I mean to know Him as you know yourself, to truly experience God, right, is not to tear away the veil that hides Him from you. It's to realize that there is no veil that's hiding Him from you, that everything that you've always known has been an experience of God. And that's what brings to love of God. Right? That's what brings... Love is always a function in Chassidus of closeness. Love is a function of closeness, right? There's, as we say the Avinu Malkeinu prayer, right? There's two aspects. There's my father, my king, right? The king is a relationship of fear, respect, awe, distance. Love is the relationship with the Father. Love is closeness, right? Love is mercy. Love is a personal relationship. So what is it that brings a person the most profound understanding of how close God is to him, right? Closer to him than the vein in his own neck, as it says in the Quran. This is the only Chassidus class in the world that teaches quotes from the Quran. The ultimate closeness of God is perceived, lahavdil. The ultimate closeness of God is perceived through realizing that Shem Elokim is also an experience of God. Because that throws the door open. That means that everything that I have always known, right, is really an experience of God, despite how it appears, right? That's really what the Alter Rebbe is saying. What's the metaphor given for this? There's several metaphors given for this in Chassidus. Let's do some outside discussion before we move on in the text. So first of all, the first metaphor that's given, I'll get back to the two ways, if anybody's still bothered about that. The two ways, we'll get back to that in a moment. But the first metaphor that's given in Chassidus, that's given in the famous mimer of the Rebbe Rashab called V'yadaita, right? We're on this pasuk, right, that we're discussing now. The first metaphor that's given is the metaphor, it's called in Hebrew, and I'll translate, Ein etzem mastir al etzem, which means a self cannot conceal a self. A self cannot conceal a self. And that may sound very abstract, but it's proved from halacha in Shulchan Aruch. What's the halacha in Shulchan Aruch, right? The Jewish law, right? A Jew has to wear a covering on his head, right? A Jewish man has to wear a covering on his head. Right? It says, what if I lose my head covering, I lose my yarmulke, right? Can I use my hand to cover my head as a yarmulke, right? And the halacha is that you cannot use your hand to cover your head as a yarmulke. Your own hand does not work as a kippah, right? Why? Because self does not conceal self. In other words, if the idea is to cover my head, right, I cannot cover myself with myself. Right? I cannot place something above me using my own body, using my own self, right? In fact, it says that if there are two friends, they should each cover each other's head with their hand, right? But my hand can cover your head, but it can't cover my head, because self cannot conceal self. Self doesn't cover self, right? A different metaphor from elsewhere in the Kabbalah that it gives is like a sea snail or a turtle, right? That the shell is part of the body of the animal, right? So even if the animal retracts within its shell, I point at it and I say, look, there's a snail, right? And it's no less a snail because the body is hiding within the shell. Why not? Because the shell is part of the body of the animal, right? It's the same thing precisely in the understanding of Shem Havaya and Shem Elokim. This is a very simple understanding, but the metaphor helps, the visual metaphor helps, right? It's the same idea. God is concealing himself from us, right? I don't have an experience of God here. God is concealed here. But with what is he concealing himself? With himself. Because Shem Elokim is just as united with him as Shem Havaya. So he is concealing himself with nothing other than himself. Therefore, it's a mistake to think that even my experience of the cup, right, not the truth of the cup, which is that it's like the ray of the sun in the sun and totally one with the speech of God, which is true, but even my experience of the cup, which, so to speak, exists outside of that, because Shem Elokim creates a new perspective, even that new perspective is an experience of God. It's an experience of God. You're looking at something else, right? You're no longer looking at the body or the fleshy body of the animal. You're looking at its shell, right? Or you're no longer looking at the if a person covers their face with their own hands, right? So you're no longer looking at the face. But what are you still looking at? You're still looking at the person. You're still looking at the same self, right? So my experience of the divine concealment is not the same as the experience of the revelation. On the other hand, the point is not to get too distracted by the difference in the experience, because the fact is the same. The fact is the same, right? The concealment is just as godly as the revelation. The hands are just as much a part of him as the face, right? And the truth is, the metaphor goes even deeper. The metaphor goes even deeper, because if you think about it, right, the face or the body of the thing, right, it even works with the sea slug, although it may be less pleasant to contemplate, the sea snail, pardon me. The face, right? The face is also just a part of the body, which is why it's an even better metaphor, right? Because the face is not me, right? The body is not me. I'm a person that's inside of here, right? I'm a soul. I'm a soul that is giving the body life, right? That makes the body alive. If, God forbid, a person was to pass away, you wouldn't say that you're looking them in the face, right? It's something else. It's some other experience. To look someone in the face is to look at the person inside of the face, right? You're looking at what the face gives you a window into, right? The eyes are a window into the soul, right? Very famously. You're looking at the soul. So it's the same thing exactly here, right? God himself, in other words, is neither definitively the experience of Havaya or the experience of Elikim. In other words, me being upset that I can't have the experience of Havaya, the experience of God's light, that when I see the cup, I don't see God's speech constantly bringing it into existence. This is like a person that's upset because they can only see the hand instead of the face, right? But why is that foolish? Because even the face is not seeing the person. Right? The face is just conveying the deeper truth. The face itself is just external. The face is no more the person than the hand, right? It's just that the face conveys it in a way that it's more obvious that the person's here. But the hand is just as much the person's hand as the face is the person's face, right? The person is really neither of these things. These are both just means of the person's expression, whether the hand or the face. Therefore, similarly, so too, God is equally distant from Havaya and Elikim. You think that Shem Havaya, because you see the way in which everything is constantly created by God, because you experience it, that it's more godly, right? What we're saying here is fundamentally different. It's not about the experience, right? Experience this way, experience that way. Neither is God. God himself is beyond this. God is beyond what can be experienced. Right? So therefore, because God is beyond what can be experienced, because God is not Havaya, because Havaya is only the breath of God, but is not God himself, therefore, God is not more expressed in his breath than in the letters which shape it. Right? To use a different one of our metaphors. Right? God is equally in the revelation and the concealment. Right? The revelation, the difference between revelation and concealment is a difference in experience. But in essence, in where is God's self, he is equally in both. So that's one explanation. Then there's a second explanation, which is even deeper, even deeper. The metaphor for this situation, okay? The metaphor for this situation is metaphor. The metaphor is metaphor. We're going to discuss metaphor itself, the process of making metaphors. And to make things even more confusing, because I think the true depth of this is not fully understood until you go all the way, let's use the metaphor of God's kindness itself. Right? The metaphor of God's kindness itself, right? God's kindness, obviously, as we learned in chapter 4, very clearly, very explicitly, God's kindness is totally infinite, totally unknowable to human beings, right? We call it his kindness, right? kindness is a metaphor. It's a metaphor meant to indicate something about this aspect of godliness, right? But the true nature of this aspect of godliness is not captured by the word kindness, right? Human kindness pales in comparison, right? It's the infinite to the finite. It's incommensurate, totally removed, infinitely removed from God's kindness, right? In fact, if we saw God's kindness, so to speak, if we suddenly had a direct experience of it, we wouldn't necessarily see why it should be called kindness rather than severity. In other words, the distinctions are so fine, are so abstract, are so subtle, right? That in that realm of infinite expressions that we totally have no inkling of whatsoever, we may not be able to even see the distinction so clearly. Right? But that's a separate point. So why we actually give them these different names, right, will become clear in a moment, right? So the whole point is metaphor. When we say God's kindness, right, we're using a metaphor. What is a metaphor? What is a metaphor? Chassidus explains what a metaphor is. A metaphor, called a mashal in Chassidus, right, like Mishle, the book of Proverbs, King Solomon's Proverbs, which Proverbs is more correctly translated as metaphors, right, allegories. A mashal, a metaphor. A metaphor, so the teacher wants to teach an idea to his student. But this idea is totally beyond the student's understanding, right? So what he does is he makes a metaphor. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is something unrelated to the idea, fundamentally, right? I find a different thing, right? Kindness and God's kindness don't necessarily, right? Like I said, this is a very distant relation, right? But I find something else that exists in the world of the student, right? This idea that I'm trying to convey does not exist in the world of the student at all. So I have to find something that exists in their world, something they do understand, right? What do we understand? We understand human kindness, right? So then what I do is that by saying that the idea that the student cannot understand is like, in some profound way, right? It has a relationship with this thing that they do understand, right? The thing that they do understand and the thing that I'm trying to teach them, which they cannot understand, have a relationship. They're able to bridge the gap between one and the other, right? The teacher encloses this idea in sort of an outer shell, right? He encloses it in a package. He packages it as a metaphor. This metaphor can be taken in by the student, can be understood by the student, and the student, because he understands this packaging, because it's in his world, this idea, he's able to unpack it and get to the idea that the teacher was trying to tell him. That was beyond his understanding by itself, right? This is basically what you have to do. You're packaging the idea, right? If we have our computer savvy people, right? The same thing happens over a network, right? The message gets packaged, right? Such that the receiver is able to understand it, right? There's packets and the whole thing, all the layers, whatever. So the receiver is able to understand. It's the exact same thing, the exact same concept, right? And the point is, the package ostensibly is not the same thing as the idea that's trying to be conveyed. It's a different idea, right? And the student is all confused. You're trying to tell me about this infinite power of God, right? And yet now you're telling me about how Moses rescues a lamb that wandered astray, right? You're trying to tell me about this infinite cosmic thing that I have no understanding of. Now you're talking about Moses and a goat. I don't see the connection, right? And the teacher will patiently explain to you, no, just as Moses was kind to the goat, so too there's something like that in an infinite way, in a much higher and more abstract way. There's something like that God does, right? That's a metaphor. So this metaphor, this whole thing that I've just told you, right, about the metaphor itself is a metaphor, right? Bear with me. We're talking about Havaya and Elokim, right? Havaya, God's self-revelation, right? God's the experience of God's pure speech, right? Such that if we look at the cup, all we would see is God's breath, is God constantly speaking it into existence. So Shem Havaya, right, is an idea that our world could not understand, right? Shem Havaya is an idea that if you want the cup to exist, as we've explained at great length, right? If you want the cup to exist as a cup, right? Shem Havaya alone doesn't do it. If it was Shem Havaya alone, all you would see is an expression of God. You wouldn't see a cup as a cup, Right? So for us to be able to accept it, in other words, what is the student? The student in the metaphor, here's where it's a little tricky, is actually the thing that is being created. Right? When we're talking about a teacher trying to explain something to a student using the metaphor of kindness to explain God's kindness, right? The student is a separate receiver from the teacher who is already pre-existing, right? The student exists, the teacher exists, and now the teacher is trying to give something to the student. When God creates with Havaya and Elohim, the student is the thing that is being created. It's the result of the process, which those words should ring a bell because we spoke about this back in, I believe, chapter 4, right? That God's speech is a process. What is the creation? The appearance that process has a result, right? That's basically what Shem Elohim accomplishes. That there is an appearance that process terminates in some stable, separate existence apart from God. Yes, following me so far, roughly? So God has an authentic self-expression, an infinite self-expression in which he creates. But that infinite self-expression cannot be received by the creation. It cannot be that it can be both a cup and I can see Shem Havaya in it. If I see Shem Havaya in it, then it's not a cup anymore. Then it's just an expression of God. So what does he do that there should be able to be a result of this process, that there should be a cup as a cup? He encloses his kindness. He packages it in a metaphor, which is like Shem Elohim. Shem Elohim is like when the teacher packages his teaching in a metaphor. Because what is Shem Elohim? What is Shem Elohim? The metaphor is we go to a different idea entirely. The student can't even see how it's related, and we put these two things together so the student is able to understand. So too, Shem Elohim is a totally different power of God, right? A totally different power of God with which he conceals himself, right? He hides the fact that the process is present, that the process of creation is here, and what you get is a result in the end. You get a resulting creation. However, you then have the end of the process, which the end of the process is that what does the student now have? The student does not have just a metaphor. He doesn't have just the packaging of the divine idea. He doesn't just have this other divine power, because that divine power of concealment is really only being used for the process of revelation, which is the first point of the two things that we're saying here. The first point is that this concealment is only for the purpose of revelation, right? Think back to what I was saying before, right? Einstein, when we were talking about Einstein and the freshman, we said Einstein conceals his knowledge and then teaches what the freshman is able to understand, right? What we're saying now is a much more apt metaphor. Is a much more apt metaphor for what God does. It's not that God conceals and then reveals. It is that the very process of concealment is the process of revelation. It is by teaching the metaphor that he teaches what it's a metaphor for. He teaches the original idea. It is by expressing in Shem Elohim, it is by concealing himself that he is revealing himself in this lower place, in this limited creation. So the act of concealment is really the act of revelation. Yes? Havaya and Elohim kul echad. Right? The original idea and the metaphor are really the same thing, because the student is really receiving both. He's not receiving just the metaphor. He's receiving the idea that's encoded and packaged in this metaphor. Right? Not just that, but it goes even further. It goes even further. Because not only does the student have the message encoded in the metaphor, right? And this is really the chidush here. This is the innovation. This is the new thing we're saying here. The new thing we're saying here is that not only does the student have the metaphor, but when the teacher looks at the metaphor, the teacher sees only the idea that's present in the metaphor. Again, when the teacher is trying to teach us about God's kindness, from the example of Moshe and the little goat, right? Once the teacher has made the metaphor, right? And he teaches us the metaphor. He doesn't see when he looks at Moshe and the goat. He doesn't see just a story about Moshe and the goat, right? When he teaches the metaphor, right, there's two fundamental perspectives on the metaphor. There's two perspectives on the metaphor. The perspectives split, right? When the student hears about Moshe and the sheep, the student is confused because the student doesn't understand why we're talking about something else now. The teacher, when he teaches about Moshe and the sheep, is not confused at all. He doesn't see it as something else, right? On the contrary, Moshe and the sheep is just an extension of the very idea that the teacher wants to teach. Right? It's further the same thing. It's the same thing, just taken to another level, right? There's God's kindness in the abstract, and there's God's kindness. There's kindness in the more practical, right? Which I see in Moshe, the way that Moshe Rabbeinu dealt with the little wandering animal. Right? So the teacher, from the teacher's perspective, it's not that he has an idea and then he makes a metaphor and he knows that the metaphor is related to this idea, and then he packages the metaphor and the idea together. It's really that in the metaphor, he sees that the metaphor is just more of the idea. It's not a separate thing, right? This is really Havaya V'Elokim Kol Echad. When God speaks the cup into existence, there's two stages, right? There's the divine speech in a revealed way, which is speaking the cup into existence, right, at every moment. But there's also the concealment of that divine reality within the cup. But when God looks at the concealment, right, it's not that the concealment is a different power. Again, it's the same thing again in different words, right, that we've been saying over and over and over. It's not that the concealment is a different power. It's that the concealment is just a further expression of Havaya in a different way. It's a further expression of the divine speech. This divine concealment is not a concealment, right? In fact, instead of being a concealment, it's the only means by which the teacher can explain this idea to the student. The only means by which God's revelation can extend down even to such a limited existence as this cup is through Shem Elokim. So Shem Elokim is not a concealment. It's not covering over God, right? It's like the hand and the face. It's like the shell and the animal. Right? They both come, the metaphor, the analogy and the analog, the metaphor and the idea that is trying to teach really express him equally. They're equally expressions of the teacher. They're equally expressions of the idea that the teacher wants to teach. Right? So it's not just, this metaphor from metaphors, right? So this metaphor from metaphors, the corresponding idea that we would say with the water in the red cup, right, is that the cup itself is of the same essence as the water. The cup and the water are really the same thing. They appear different, they are experienced differently, but the cup and the water are really the same thing. The cup cannot conceal over the water, because the cup and the water are both expressions of something higher. They're both equally expressions of something higher. And the only way that we are able to see the water is through the cup. So why is the cup here? Not to conceal the water, to reveal the water, to reveal the water. It's really the same thing. So, I should point out, it's late, I should point out that what we're saying here is not that the metaphor, when God makes the metaphor, right? So the metaphor is a metaphor for Elokim, right? The idea of metaphor is a metaphor for Elokim. And when God sees that in the metaphor, the original teaching that he wants to give over, he sees that in the metaphor, that's the same thing as Havaya V'Elokim Kol Echad. So what does that mean? That means that in God's experience of the cup, right? Let's talk about God's experience of the cup. God's experience of this cup happens at two levels. There's a Havaya level and an Elokim level. At the Havaya level experience of this cup is like a ray of the sun in the sun and has no separate and independent existence from godliness whatsoever. In the Elohim experience of this cup is a white object in a certain place in a certain time with its own nature and its own form that is separate from God. That experience of the object that is separate from God is also an experience of God. That experience of the object which is separate from God is also an experience of God, because what is this object? This object is only a metaphor for Shem Havaya. It's only a metaphor for Shem Havaya. It's not truly a separate existence. The metaphor conveys the godliness which goes into it. It's not
describing a duality.
No, I'm not describing it. I'm just trying to make a unity out of a duality.
You're describing a duality of which one thing we perceive,
Yeah.
and the other we don't normally perceive.
Yes.
Unless we're a chassid, unless we're a tzaddik.
Yes. The tzaddik perceives both of them the same, right?
Yes.
But the point is that our perceptions do not match the reality. Or that's not even a good way of putting it. The real way of putting it is that we don't even really know what our perceptions, our non-godly perceptions are. That's really the way of putting it, right? It's not that our perceptions are false. My perception of the cup as a separate object from God is not false. It's true, according to Shem Elohim, right? And Shem Elohim is not a lie. How can it be a lie? It's just as godly as Shem Havaya. God forbid to say such a thing. Right? So my experience of the cup, even in the mundane, regular experience of the cup, right, is an experience of nothing other than godliness. Right? The difference is that if I had an experience of it in a way of Havaya, it would blow my mind. But because I have an experience of it in a way of Shem Elohim, in a way of nature, right, it doesn't blow my mind. It's accepted as regular reality. But neither one of these experiences is more godly than the other. And I just want to finish out tonight by saying that can't emphasize enough that it's not the idea that God is pressing his concealment into the service of revelation. In other words, it's not that his concealment is naturally separate from him, but he's using it here in a way of revelation, right? Like, for example, a goat, right, is naturally a totally different thing than God's kindness, but a teacher might press the goat into service in a metaphor to try and explain God's kindness, right? So inherently, this thing is not connected to the idea the teacher wants to teach, but he's pressing it into the service of teaching this idea, right? That's like saying, God forbid, that there's nothing inherently about the cup, right, about its qualities, its earthly, mundane qualities, that's godly. Right? It's just that those non-godly things have been, because God is using them as part of the act of creation, as part of the act of self-revelation, as part of Havaya, therefore they also reveal it. Right? In other words, if you look at it that way, that leaves this whole realm where the essential thing has nothing to do with God, right? In other words, Shem Elohim is really essentially a lack of God, God forbid, but the lack of God can sometimes be used as part of his expression. So ultimately, it's technically a good thing, although essentially it's a concealment of God, and God wouldn't really be there unless God were using it in this way. Right? Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. On the contrary, because these ideas are equally godly, because this hiddenness of God and this revelation of God are truly equally godly, right? Therefore, there is nothing foreign that exists that is foreign to the revelation of God inherently. Right? That's a different way of saying what we're saying. In other words, it's not unlike the earthly teacher, where the goat might have where goats have nothing fundamentally to do with God's kindness, but he's using the goat to explain God's kindness, right? So he presses it into service, even though it inherently conceals this idea, so to speak, or is unrelated to this idea, to God, because God is God, right? And everything comes from God. Everything is created by God. Therefore, there is nothing which is inherently unrelated to God. There is no such thing, right? In other words, it's a bit circular in a way, if you really think about it. But the point is that because he's God, and it's God's process of creation we're describing, there is no notion of something being pressed into service in the revelation of God, right? The whole thing a priori, right? Ab initio, the whole thing from the very beginning exists only for this purpose. It's not that God found a metaphor, he found a concealment and then used it as a revelation. Why does the concealment exist in the first place is for this purpose, right? Which now this becomes recursive, because then you can go back into any earthly metaphor. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying now, but I'll use it to close the class anyway. You can go down into any earthly metaphor, and because all the metaphors that we know exist within God's reality, right? Every metaphor, if it's used for a godly concept, is this way. So in other words, an earthly teacher trying to connect a goat to some earthly idea, there may fundamentally be no connection. But if you are trying to explain a godly idea, you are trying to explain God, everything is inherently an appropriate metaphor for God, because everything is created by God in this process of Havaya and Elikim. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that this is really like the third level, where the metaphor that is the metaphor actually turns out to be the reality, right? Or a different way of putting it is that God is the ultimate analog of all analogies. God is the ultimate thing that all metaphors are metaphors for. It is impossible to conceive of a metaphor that does not, if the metaphor is taken up the ladder far enough, terminate in God. Right? All metaphors are metaphors for God, ultimately, if you really want to trace them back up, because the thing that the metaphor is a metaphor for is itself a metaphor, and that leads to a metaphor, and that leads to a metaphor, and eventually these metaphors are all metaphors for a higher concept. So really our example, which is why I use that example of the sheep trying to explain God's kindness, the example is itself an instantiation of what I'm trying to of what we're teaching here. This metaphor itself, right? The sheep, of Moshe rescuing the sheep, that's what I'm actually talking about. That itself, because everything is created with Havaya and Elikim, and because that sheep has two aspects, one which is divine in a revealed way, in that it's created something from nothing at every moment, and another aspect where it has its own nature and it seems to be totally separate from God. And because both of those natures and everything about the sheep is godly, whether it's divine revelation or it's divine concealment, therefore this itself is actually a metaphor for God. In other words, everything is actually a metaphor. Right? When I say the metaphor is the metaphor, that means everything. Everything that exists is a metaphor for God. That's really what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. He's saying by this process where the divine concealment and the divine revelation are one, everything, if you trace it up, is really a divine metaphor. So we live our world, our universe that we live within, by the understanding Havaya v'Elikim kul echad, that his revelation and his concealment are one. We understand that our universe is really just, in every detail, in every part, and in every creation, is really just a metaphor for understanding God, which is why it's here. That's to be continued next week, God willing.